Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth in a five-part series. The series is about challenges for Muslims in the 15th and 21st century. It's a very, very important conversation that I believe that Muslims should have worldwide. And I'm hoping that this series will spark that conversation amongst Muslims, number one, in terms of the obligations that we have in terms of leadership. Secondly, I'm hoping that what I've been saying in the past three sessions, and this session as well, will illuminate and clarify some of the issues that non-Muslims might have in understanding Islam, particularly in relationship to the issue of leadership and whether a person is doing it just to learn about Islam, to live in community with us, or somebody who's considering taking Shahada, that is saying La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, and becoming a part of the worldwide community of Muhammad. I hope it's beneficial to you. The last point is that we were hoping that you've got from our last segment is that there is a model that Muslims have of leadership in the 15th and the 21st century, and that's the model of what we call the prophetic paradigm of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. That model included taking a look at the difference between power, authority, and leadership, which we did in the last segment. That model included a foundational base for the model that included devotion to Allah and His Messenger, peace be upon him, which meant loving and obeying Allah and His Messenger. It also meant discipline that came from inside the person who would be leader, that he or she should be self-disciplined, because this is the kind of role model that you want in front of the people, not somebody who cannot control him or herself. The third is a person who is into development, educational development, that is, and we focused on two parts of that. First, the acquisition of knowledge, which is a hallmark of the Muslim faith, that we should strive to learn from cradle to the grave, as it were, and there's great benefits in making sure that our children, particularly our daughters, are educated. And then the implementation of that knowledge, because knowledge without implementation has no benefit. We can see from looking at our last segment that the Muslims have a particular form of leadership, which we've chosen to call Muslim leadership, that includes devotion, that includes discipline, that includes development, and it's one that we hope that Muslims would implement and the non-Muslims would understand as our way of being. We're now in the fourth segment of our five-part series, and as we promised the last time, it will be focused on the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. You probably have never heard of such a thing. I call it the PVEE syndrome. You probably never heard of such a thing. It's something I developed in terms of thinking about how Muslims are having difficulty in providing effective leadership. We're going to talk about this in a moment, but what we'd like to do is first to set a little bit of context for talking about the PV syndrome. There's a verse in the Quran in Surah Ma'idah, and the verse pretty much goes, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice and witness to fair dealing, and don't let the hatred of others towards you cause you to swerve from justice. Be just." That's closer to piety. This is more or less the meaning of this particular verse in the chapter called Ma'idah. This is the fifth chapter and the 8th verse. Now, the thing to understand in terms of the context for this particular chapter is, first of all, that it is aimed specifically at the Muslims. It begins in Arabic, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O those of you who believe. And so there are also verses in the Quran that are directed at the non-Muslims. Ya ayyuhan nas is directed at the non-Muslims, but this is directed particularly at the Muslims. And it calls the Muslims to justice, right? It says, so stand out firmly for justice, right? In other places in the Quran, this model of justice has a very high mark. In other words, it's not just be just with people who are just with you, or be just with people who are in your family, or be just with people who are in your inner circle, or be just with people that you like, but it's a standard of justice that we find in Surah An-Nisa, and the essence of it is stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to fair dealing against yourself. To be just against yourself is a pretty high standard. Against your parents, that's a high standard. How many of us would be just if it involved our parents? Against your kin, our blood relatives or our relatives by marriage, and against rich or poor. Sometimes we are unjust by supporting the poor or the downtrodden simply because we feel that we need to protect them. Even if they've done an injustice, we won't speak out against it. And what's said in Surah 4, 135, is that God is the better able to protect these kinds of people, and that we should have this kind of worldview. And back to Ma'idah 5:8, Surah 5, number 8, we find that Allah ends that ayah, ends that verse in the Quran with the admonition that this kind of justice is closer to piety. Remember what we said about devotion the last time, and this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, loving and obeying Allah and His Messenger. And if you love and obey Allah and His Messenger, you're going to be one who's going to be just. And the reason why I'm talking about this in the context of the PV syndrome is that I find as I travel throughout the Muslim world, and as I travel amongst people who are not Muslims, that people swerve from justice because of what I call the PV syndrome, the Post Victimization Ethical Exemption Syndrome. That is to say that people feel because of a situation that's happened within their particular community, they're exempt from the standard of justice that they are normally required to follow. Remember, we're talking about leadership here. We're talking about the challenges that face leadership in the 15th and 21st century, and that in a situation where many Muslim countries are coming out of post-colonial situations, in a situation where some Muslim countries have been invaded by others, some Muslims are occupied by others, it's very, very tempting, extremely, extremely tempting to lower the standard of justice. In addition, we'll find ourselves where I live in the United States of America, when we're surrounded by people who might not be honest, we're surrounded by people who might be corrupt, we're surrounded by people who don't tell the truth, we're surrounded by people who double deal. We might be inclined, given our situation, because lots of times those people don't tell the truth, they double deal, in the service of being against the Muslims. We're surrounded by these people. We're tempted to lower our standards of justice. And what I want to say about this is that my understanding of these two verses that we recited, I'm not a person who's qualified to make commentary on the Quran. I'm not a person who's qualified to give exegesis of the Quran. I'm not a mufassir. I can't make tafsir or give adequate commentary on the Quran. So therefore, you shouldn't take it from me. You should take it from a person of knowledge. But my meager understanding of the verses that we talked about, the one in Ma'idah and the one in An-Nisa about justice, is that the standard of justice is an absolute one. Listen to me, Muslims, and listen well. Your Islam is no good to you unless you can put it into action in times of crisis. Again, listen, Muslims. Your Islam is no good to you unless you can put into action in times of crisis. I mean, the reality is that all of us can be just and kind and all of these things when we're not having any difficulty. The real test, the real litmus test for whether or not La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah means anything to us is when we are faced with a crisis that involves our family, that involves our kin, that involves loss of property, that involves loss of life. We know the Quran says that Shaitan threatens, the devil threatens us with loss of life, with loss of property, and the like. So if we understand this kind of situation, then we will put ourselves in a situation to say that we will stay close to the Quran, that we'll stay close to the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that we will immerse ourselves in learning and application of the Quran and the Sunnah. So when we come up against these very, very difficult situations and find that we're tempted to lower our standard of justice, we won't do it. Because the fact of the matter is that the standard that Allah and His Messenger, Allah gave us through His Messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the standard that the messenger implemented consistently, is the standard that we want to have that will improve the life for all human beings, whether they're our neighbors or not, whether they're Muslims or not, and it's a part of being a role model. Because oftentimes, if you study the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that many people came to Islam by watching this standard of justice and understanding that this standard of justice was a part and parcel of what Islam was about, was a part and parcel about what La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah was all about. So in understanding that, we've set the context for understanding how it comes about that people get involved in the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. Okay, some background that might be useful in terms of talking about this concept. First, there's something called the post-traumatic stress disorder that many people developed in Vietnam, coming back during the war in Vietnam from the United States. When we come back after the break, we'll talk a little bit about that background and continue on talking about the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. We'll be right back after this break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our second half of this particular segment of a five-part series. This is a five-part series that is entitled Challenges for Muslims in the 15th and the 21st Century. And we're in the fourth of the five-part series. We're in the second half of the fourth of the five-part series. And we're focusing on something called the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. We spent the first part of this episode talking about the notion of justice and the standard of justice that we have in Islam. In the prior program, we talked about the model of Islamic leadership that we argue that Muslims need to contextualize and implement in the 15th and the 21st century. And part of that model, as we said in the first part of this episode, is devotion to Allah and His Messenger, and discipline and development, that is learning authentic knowledge and applying that knowledge. And what more important place to apply it when we're talking about leadership, when we're talking about family relations, which we're talking about our relationship with our neighbors, when we're talking about our role in the broader community, our role on the national scene, our role in the international scene, than to talk about the standard of justice. Because if we look at the situation that we see in the family, if we look at the situation that we see in our communities, if we look at the situation that we see in the nation states, if we look at the international situations, one of the major difficulties that we see is that people in leadership are not just. They're not fair. They play favorites and say, on one hand, they say, we believe X, and on another hand, they do Y. And so if we understand this situation, we'll begin to understand where I'm coming from when we talk about the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. That's the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. And secondly, the reality is that it's a syndrome that overtakes them, and when they are participating in it, they're not like themselves. In other words, it changes their whole outlook, it changes their whole behavior, and this is what we have in the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. So what is it? We've been talking about it for a while. We've been previewing it in the early shows. What is the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome? It, at its essence, is the belief that because my people either are or have been oppressed in some kind of way, I am released from the ethical standards that I would normally accept. Again, the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome is the belief that because my people either are or have been, have been oppressed in some kind of way, I am released from the same standards of ethical behavior I would normally do. Let me use an example from the African American experience, something I'm familiar with and I've been through myself. During the civil rights era of the 60s and 70s in the United States of America, we had people who often rioted in their communities. And they would say that they were rioting because their people had been oppressed, that they were looting because their people had been oppressed, that they were burning down stores because their people had been oppressed, and that they were tired of taking it, and so therefore they were going to riot, they were going to loot, and they were going to burn down stores. Now, I think if you look at this from the outside, you can see the fallacy in this, because I'm going to rob, I'm going to loot, I'm going to burn down stores because my people are or have been oppressed. Doesn't make very much sense. But if you are part of the oppressed group, it makes a great deal of sense, because it's a lashing out due to frustrations, and you feel justified in doing what you're doing. And so we had literally scores of people who had this particular mindset in the African American community during that particular time, who looted, who robbed, who burned down buildings, and they said it was okay. And under other circumstances, no way would they do it. Under other circumstances, in other words, they would think robbery is wrong, looting is wrong, and burning is wrong. Let's switch into the 15th and the 21st century for Muslims. What we find amongst many Muslim societies and amongst many Muslims who say that it's okay for us to do certain things, it's okay for us to, for instance, kill innocent people because our people either have been or are oppressed. Anybody who is slightly familiar, you don't have to be an alim, you don't have to be a scholar. Anybody who's slightly familiar with the biography of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, knows that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not condone terroristic activities. And by terroristic activities, I mean activities that are aimed at innocent people for the shock value, activities that are aimed at innocent people in order to get back, in order to get revenge, activities that are aimed at people that you know are innocent, that are not combatants in the war, but you feel that you're justified in aiming at them because some country did something to you or to your people at a particular time. The reality is this, is that at base, this is not about justice. Because if you look at the verses that we talked about, Allah says, in the meaning of which is stand out for justice as witnesses of fair dealing against yourself, against your parents, against your kin, against rich, against poor. And so there's no room there, particularly when we look at the biography of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for such terroristic activities. So the reality is that many of us, and I say not the majority of us, not the majority of Muslims, but enough to make a difference, have this post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome, that they don't have to follow the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, simply because they feel that their people have been oppressed. And this is a kind of syndrome that on the one hand, they don't really know where they got it from. They just feel self-righteous about it, right? And on the other hand, they do it and they feel self-justified in doing it. And sometimes they're very unconscious about doing it. And indeed, they might even argue that this kind of thing is Islamically justified. What compounds this situation is that oftentimes people are making these activities based on fallacious or conspiracy theories. Theories about what one government has done to another. I mean, there is a whole cottage industry in the United States of conspiracy theories about the John F. Kennedy, one of the president of the United States who was assassinated in the 60s, conspiracy theories about that, and most recently conspiracy theories about 9/11. My advice to the Muslims on this issue of conspiracy theories is the following. First of all, when it comes to justice and injustice, there are many players on the international scenes that do unjust things. They do unjust things, and they stand behind them. We could name many examples, but they stand behind the unjust things that they do. And we, particularly as many people do, should focus our energy on things that we know to be true. Because when we go behind these conspiracy theories, which run rampant in the United States and the Middle East and other places, we often will find ourselves put in the position of saying that something is true that's not true, and we often find people acting on them. And I'm not taking sides in the theory, but I would like to get people to understand that these kind of conspiracy theories will lead people to the kind of injustice that I'm talking about. So if people have this post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome, what you'll find in them is that they'll try to minimize, apologize, and do everything not to accept responsibility for something that was done outside of the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. I would argue that if you look around the world scene today, in the 15th and 21st century, this kind of mentality, this kind of thinking that I am justified in doing something wrong to somebody because they did something wrong to my people, or doing wrong to innocent people because they did something wrong to my people, you'll find this amongst people who are in power in governments, and I'm talking particularly about Muslims right now, and you'll find people who say they're fighting for liberation, and they're going outside of the Quran and the Sunnah in order to do it. If we're going to be effective as Muslim leadership in the 15th and the 21st century, we need to let go of this post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome, because the standard of justice that Allah Ta'ala, Allah Most High, has is a very high one, and it does not allow us to excuse the killing of innocents because someone killed some innocent people in our family, in our national group, in our religious group. And we need to let this idea go because it is not within the Quran and the Sunnah, and it prevents us from taking on the leadership role that we say that we want and we used to have for the whole world. So that's the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. That's episode 4 of this 5-part series on challenges facing Muslims in the 15th and the 21st century. I hope you'll join us for the final episode when we'll take up building Muslim infrastructure wherever you are. In the meantime, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.